Museum of Craft and Design. We're very happy to have you here during Design Week. My name is Marie Dining, I'm the Programs Director, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this very special talk between Ariel, who is our Curatorial Director, and John Roloff, who guest curated along with Neil Forrest, a roadmap to Stardust.
Hi everybody, my name is Ariel Zaccheo. I'm the Curatorial Director here at the Museum of Craft and Design. I'm so excited to be on. I'm so excited to be joined by John Roloff. I'm going to read bios in a second, and you'll see he's very impressive. And you'll see throughout the talk. We worked together to create a roadmap to Stardust, which is the exhibition that's kind of in the center. We've been calling it the chamber or the cave, but it's this little area inside the other exhibition. We've been working on this for many years and thinking of it. John is part of a collaborative with Neil Forrest, who is in Nova Scotia, Canada, and therefore cannot join us today, although he might be with us on live stream, and if so, hi Neil.
He's waving back.
Which is great. I just want to mention that we are in the Make Art Lab here. So this is technically part of the Beau McCall Buttons On exhibition and not part of a roadmap to Stardust. And as such, we have some photos going through. If you haven't walked through the exhibition yet, I totally encourage you to go do that. It's better to see it in person. We can't all fit in there, but one or two at a time could definitely do. And then thank yous. I want to send a huge shout out and thank you to SF Design Week. And so amazing that they are able to put these events on all throughout San Francisco and bring us all together. And there's so many events going on throughout the city this week. I want to send a huge thanks to NCD staff, especially programs. Thank you guys for setting all this up and working on screens and live streams and all of that. And a huge thank you to you guys. I know there's a million ways you could spend your Sunday afternoon, and it is just like very heartening to see you all here talking with us. The way we're gonna set this up, we're gonna talk, I'm gonna intro John and give bios, then we'll kind of discuss a little bit about the exhibition in general, and then my thought is we'll just touch on some themes that are both part of John's artistic practice throughout, and also very evident in the show itself. So, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Okay, everyone's favorite, bios. Just first of all, I'm so fortunate to know John Roloff and Neil Forrest. These two artists expose each other's strengths in such an amazing way. They have melded minds, and when they're together, they riff almost like improv jazz together. Collaboratively, they work under the moniker Ort Cloud X, which I think speaks to the galactic and expansive nature of their collective interests. So as members of the collaborative Ort Cloud X, John Roloff and Neil Forrest create installations inspired from specific ceramic artifacts that offer ideas and questions toward our collective future. We'll talk a lot about that. I'm going to give Neil's bio, even though he's not here, because he is here in spirit and in live stream. So Neil Forrest is an internationally exhibiting ceramic artist whose work emphasizes corporeality and materiality. Forrest is noted for rethinking ornament in postmodern space. His work extends the reach of ceramics as three-dimensional matrices that could fill build spaces, so it's very architectural. His recent works and installations pursue specific questions of topical or anthropological concern. More narrative in nature, these often conflate historical archetypes with popular modernist iconography. He's received several Canadian and Norwegian arts grants and lectured at international architecture and craft conferences. Neil Forrest is Professor Emeritus at NSCAD University and former research professor at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts in Norway. Amazing. John Roloff is an internationally exhibiting artist who works conceptually with sight, process, and natural systems in the form of environmental and gallery installations. His work is fundamentally about ecology in an expanded frame, engaging interrelated cycles of natural and man-made materials and processes. This worldview, originating in studies of the earth sciences, was developed through the practice of ceramics, installations, and conceptual proposals to evolve psychic, alchemical, and transformative merging of physical matter and living systems across geologic time through the lens of global metabolism. We're going to get through some of that today. John's work has been seen both outdoors and in exhibitions at the Whitney, UC Berkeley, SF MoMA, Smithsonian, Photo Scene Cologne, the Venice Architectural and Art Biennales, and the Snow Show Kemi, Finland. He's a recipient of 3 Artist Visual Arts Fellowships through the NEA, RIP, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a California Arts Council grant for visual artists, and a Bernard Osher Fellowship at the Exploratorium, and he's Professor Emeritus of Sculpture and Ceramics at SFAI. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think it should be clear from reading off those bios that the two of these human beings together, their work is in large part about interdisciplinarity. They are artists, first and foremost, but they're also theologians, philosophers, scientists, alchemists, I don't know, a million other things. But the recurring central character in both of their work is always clay. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So my first question, just to kind of set the scene, is how did you start working with clay, and what about the material property of clay is central to your practice?
So when you mention site-based artists, that's one reference point. If you know what it is. So Robert Irwin in probably the early 70s came up with the term of site-specific, site-generative. There's a series of terms that he sort of laid out, and then it became a way of working. When you go to a place, you look at the history of the place. And for me, that history would be geologic history, because when I was in college, I was a geology major first. I wanted to be a marine geologist. Then, the Vietnam War, a lot of cultural, shifts and stuff, and so I ended up in the art department, which turned out to be a great art department at UC Davis. And Bob Arneson was the ceramic teacher, who's also, if you don't know that history, he's one of the, a very important person in contemporary ceramics for Northern California. Anyway, the melding of the geology and the ceramics became very natural. So when I opened a drawer of dolomite, it was a white powder, I knew it as a rock formation. And I knew it as a process of how it became dolomite, in the landscape. So there was this immediate kind of repartee that it took me a while, like a number of years, to really figure out how to use that, how to actually manifest that in some way. And so a lot of site-based kilns and things like that, which were environmental firings of the, instead of buying a thing of clay and making something and putting it in a kiln, my interest was to go directly to the material in the landscape and work with it. And there were different situations where that was actually allowed and if not embraced. And so that's just kind of I guess, encapsulation of my connection to ceramics. So is that?
Yeah, no, it's incredible. And it's so interesting that the two things were one to you. Like, you're using the landscape and the site as the kiln itself. And I think something we'll keep coming back to through this talk is that ceramics and clay is earth. Like, it is the earth itself, which is such a lovely kind of overarching metaphor for this show. Just to kind of bring in our thinking around a roadmap to Stardust, I met John and Neil during one of my first shows at the museum, which was called Data Clay. That was back in 2014, a long time ago. And as part of that exhibition, John made an architecturally accurate CAD model of this building, the American Industrial Center, but linked it to its geologic history back to the Paleolithic era, I think, which was so interesting. Yeah, it could be. And I just bring that up because it links to some of these themes that carry through to a roadmap to Stardust in terms of site specificity and this idea of like geologic time, so slow time instead of quick time. So we conceived of this exhibition originally as taking place over time. That was kind of the first piece that linked us, and in phases, and that it would use the logic of a library, a cinema, and an archive all together, which are all ways of disseminating information to people. And that it would center clay as the link throughout humankind's past, present, and future, so also thinking of time in this kind of long way. And I think from those anchors, John and Neil started kind of doing their riffing and free associating. So I just want to ask again to set it up. What is your collaborative process with Neil once you get approval for a proposal?
Well, to back up a little bit, the show previous to this was called Divinations, and it was done for a ceramic conference. It was held in Sacramento in 2022. So one of the things that interested both Neil and I was the idea of cuneiform. You know, if you remember, there's actually some examples in there of impressions in clay tablets from Sumeria, and eventually it was all over that part of the world. In Turkey, the Hittites used it, the Assyrians used it. But it was in clay tablets, and those tablets. So particularly the Library of Nineveh, which was the Assyrian capital, it was a little after Sumer, had a library of all these tablets. So the idea of clay being this first linguistic, at least written linguistic, because there's an immense, history of oral traditions before that. So this transition from oral to written, using clay as a primary material, was very fascinating to us, and sort of opened up this door into, particularly for something that Neil, I didn't read all of it, but Neil read all of Gilgamesh, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, is one of the earliest creation stories that was ever written. Of course, just like in the oral tradition, there were many, many creation stories, but they were handed down. It was transmitted in a different way. So this was one of the first ones that was actually available and concretized, available to us nowadays. So that nexus of clay and language and sight, in the sense of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent, the beginning, the transition between the Paleolithic with the hunter-gatherer and the city-state, where Sumer is also considered to be one of the formative beginnings of that. It also opened up a whole idea about ecology. So this notion of how you perceive the world as a hunter-gatherer, and what happens when you start to settle down and you start doing monoculture, and you start doing raising crops, and so that transition, which is affecting us now, is something that we are really interested in. It's a kind of a subtext to the whole sort of roadmap to Stardust, in a way. So there's a political, ecological angle, there's an enthusiasm angle. We also bring in because we repartee like constantly, like we probably have 2,000 emails now between all the other shows, and lots of Zooms, and getting together when we do these other shows, and getting together for this, and so it's an intense research project. So part of site work, and in a sense also Neil's connection back to architecture, this idea of research. So when you really want to look at something that you want to explore, so that research can be digging some material out of the ground. It can be looking at, using the internet, or going for a project I did in Venice, going to the architecture library, and trying to figure out stuff that was written in Italian, and they had good pictures. So that helped. Anyway, so it's very process related, and I think a very important point for both Neil and I is that clay is so process. As a ceramic artist, you make something and then you have to let it dry, and if you don't let it dry right, then it cracks. It can, and then either you embrace the cracks, or you go, okay, I got to start over. Now I learned something. I have to do this another way. I have to figure this out. So clay becomes a teacher, which I think was really a phenomenal thing that certain kind of people respond to. And it was also, when I was teaching ceramics, what was really interesting to me was that film-based photographers were the best students that weren't already in the department, because they understood process. You take all these pictures or slides, and then you send it out to get it developed, or you do it yourself, and then you see what you got. And then when you go to the darkroom and you print, it comes up in another form. So there's this extended time period of processing and working with something. Same thing with ceramics. comes out of the bisque kiln, which is the first firing, and it looks so different. You know, before it was kind of alive because it was wet clay. Now it's this thing that's, now what do I do? So then you reinvent, you know, I'm sure usually you have ideas of where you're going to take it, but it's also the confrontation with this material in a new state, and then you do the next thing. You figure out you're going to glaze it, you're going to leave it. So a lot of decisions that are done in there are based upon all those different kinds of processes and things that you know, are endemic to ceramics.
I'm going to blow you up a little bit in that we started talking about this exhibition maybe in 2022 or 2023, I think. And Neil and John had been constantly, we checked in on Zoom all the time. We had all of these generative meetings. But it really was like 3 weeks before the exhibition opened that the work started really coming together. So like the research phase is really the important and the kind of project-based part of your collaboration from an outsider's perspective. I also, we need to have a conversation about photography.
Fair enough. Okay.
Outside of this, we need to have a conversation about photography and play.
Well, it's digital now, so it's different, but
Yeah.
sort of.
Okay, I think we should, before we get into these like deep themes,
Okay.
if we could just describe the exhibition in a narrative way. Could you explain the exhibition in one sentence?
No way. You've already heard me. You know.
It's a challenge. I have my sentence.
Well, this is to me. Okay, this has come up before. So this is, to me, it's a narrative about narratives. So the idea of the creation story as being important to all of us in different ways, in Indigenous, Native American, First Nations, to all kinds of different streams of cultures that have intermixed over the years. And so that the idea of why are we here through a story as to what that origin is was really fascinating. And so that idea of a narrative, and so we also have the narrative of the process of clay, these start to overlap. You also have the process of the geology and the river the changes in Sumeria and that. So all these things, the landscape was changing. So these ideas of change were really part of that idea. So.
It was a run-on sentence, but I'll no, I'm just kidding. And my sentence is the same.
Oh,
so,
right. Oh, that's right. It's supposed to go to be one. Okay,
no.
narrative about narratives.
Narrative of narratives, and my sentence is very similar.
So the structural system of narratives, how is that done?
Yeah.
What order do you go in, or what do you bring into the conversation? What do you leave out? So again, I'm running on, but so there's a beautiful, one of the most beautiful creation stories I know of is indigenous to North America, and if I have it right, and there are many, I think there's numerous variations. Turtle, coyote, and hummingbird were in a boat. It's not, and the sea was just everywhere. The primordial sea. Turtle goes down and at the bottom of the ocean, a teeny little amount of clay underneath his fingernails, and as soon as that was brought up, the land occurred. So it's an essential story about how land became. You look at back the narrative of science, which is also a creation story, is that, you know, it's based upon empirical knowledge, based upon observation, based upon other kinds of things, and then you have a different story, and they overlap at different points. So that whole structural system of how those things talk to each other was really important in coming from the idea of a narrative about narratives.
And my sentence is just the history of humankind as told through clay, which I think is also narratives about narratives.
Yeah. Okay.
So in thinking about writing about this exhibition, you might have noticed from listening to John that the way that John and Neil think is, I call it rhizomatic, but it's that was an idea by Deleuze and Guattari, who are French philosophers, who think about idea formation not in a linear or hierarchical way, but in this way that kind of grows, like a rhizome would be like a ginger root or a carrot or something that grows kind of out, and all of the ideas are equal to each other and just connecting. So how we'll do this talk from here on out is in this rhizomatic way, where I'll just bring up prompts or themes and let John riff. But just to bring it back to curating an exhibition, it's really hard to write that way or to like explain something in that way in a written text that's under 300 words. So what we ended up doing is I wrote like a little narrative, but then we decided to do object labels and everything else as footnotes. So on the side closest to me, as I'm looking at the exhibition, there's a text of just footnotes that relate to the objects in the show, but also just bring out different ideas. And if you connect to them, great. If you don't, move on to the next one. I bet there's one in there for you. And I think that's how we want people to enjoy this exhibition as well, is in this way of connecting to whatever pops out at you. Okay, let's start. So let's talk about time a little bit more. So I have this idea of past, present, future, and expansion over time. So if each phase of this exhibition represents a different aspect of an overall project, let's bring it back to your work just generally. I feel like your projects often use time from this kind of geological, and here we're even thinking about cosmic time. So how does that manifest for you in Roadmap?
I think part of that's why we ended up with Oort Cloud X. The Oort Cloud is a cloud of asteroid-like objects down near the Kuiper Belt, which is, I think, beyond Pluto, or there's different belts out there. And so this idea of, in our repartee, to arrive at that as a kind of name for ourselves starts that idea.
We also, I just want to bring up, like in this image that we're seeing, we see, oh, it changed. But we had the graphic of the Sombrero Galaxy. So I think there are those kind of representations within the show. And we have these astronauts, these kind of characters intermingling with the Mesopotamians or Sumerians that are there. Do you want to add on to the two kind of things happening simultaneously?
Okay, so these are Neil's dioramas. We call them dioramas because they're kind of like stage sets in a way, and similar to a diorama in a museum. And it does tell more or less the story of this time thing of the discovery, the use of this original telescope, which is what Neil made. It's in the far right corner if you go in at the other end, laying on a long platform. And then the story in the dioramas goes, well, it was buried. It's like during the time of 2,000 years since Sumeria, and then it was excavated. So that's why we Mission Clay, which is a company that's been very supportive of art projects, particularly in ceramics. They're based in Phoenix, and they make big extruded tiles, not tiles, but tubes for irrigation, and drainage and stuff. So that's what that pile is in there, is a donation from them, or at least a loan of those materials that's to represent an excavation site. So there's a large version, and then there's a small diorama version. The diorama version is more of a specific narrative, and so those are all the things that Neil made. That was his contribution. And then you can see on the wall, that's actually a map of Mars, or a photo of Mars. And what was really interesting was, if you didn't know that, you didn't recognize how it's jagged, like from NASA photos, if you look online. That could be in Southern California desert. It could be Sumeria. It could be so there's this connection between Mars and Earth that in the time frame of the larger ideas of the project, Mars is sort of the next thing, or the idea. It's more of a symbolic place for this urge for humanity to do something like that. It's not Musk. This was way before Musk. Anyway, it's more the creation myth story unfolding in a certain way, kind of at that level of ideas. That's the library. Now did you ask me?
No, we'll get there.
Okay, all right,
We're
okay.
getting ahead of it.
That's part of it.
We can talk a little bit more about, so the next kind of theme I wanted to bring up was this idea of speculative archaeologies, and we touched on that a little bit. So John has this partnership with Mission Clay, and they very kindly donated 3 gigantic crates full of shards of the pipes that he was mentioning that we were able to kind of create into looking like it was part of an archaeological dig. But I think this idea of fiction and creating kind of a narrative, again, creating our own narrative within these many narratives was important. And this idea of suggesting like an alternate timeline in a way, where we've gone back and uncovered these telescopes from the past and are thinking about how they can project us into the future, that's really where the exhibition came together or started feeling really exciting for me.
So part of that has to do with, even referring back to the earlier question about time, there are people who say that time doesn't exist. There are some physicists who figured that out in a certain way. But the idea of nonlinearity, which means it's not, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. It might be Monday, Saturday, something, that would be a really simple idea, or version of it. But the idea of nonlinear time, where things are woven in a different way, that's very much like the art process. So you're responding to things, and in my mind, if you're particularly clay, it really does this, you have to let it speak. So as it's drying out, it's changing, it's moving. So over time, you learn how to listen, and it'll suggest things to you. Also, your mind is working. So this time period of actually the working process is nonlinear in a way, and it's also very fluid. It's just the idea of fluid time. So.
I love that you brought that up. Let's move on to the next one, which is myths, divination, and alchemy, which I think you touched on a little bit in this idea that clay has to speak and it is an alchemical process in a way, because clay changes from one state to another via fire. And I just want to bring up some other, you brought up the beautiful myth of the turtle, but I want to bring up some other creation myths to show how universal this is. There's Prometheus is a pretty standard one that everyone would know. In Judeo-Christian, in the Bible, God made Adam out of dust. That's a quote in Genesis, I think. In Chinese culture, there's a myth about a goddess named Nua who made humans out of clay from the riverbank by the Yellow River. She flicked her fingers and thus humans were made, humankind. There's the golem in Jewish folklore, which is more of like a social justice warrior made by man, less a deity. But it's so universal. There's Egyptian god Nu. There's South Asian. Almost every culture has a creation myth that connects man to clay. And I think that's so interesting. The alchemy of clay to flesh is really interesting to me, which we're not really exploring as much here. But you mentioned the turtle myth. Is there another one that's close to your heart? I can see like Prometheus in here, specifically with the origin device.
I'm going to jump around a little bit. So that song, took 100 pounds of clay. Remember that? I think the doo-wop, 50s, 60s. And so to me, one of the layers into our whole process is popular culture. So Purple Rain by Prince, Purple Haze, Hendrix, this idea of purple somehow is resonating. So we rewrote a little segment of Gilgamesh's story about the purple rain. It was a dream, one of his dreams. And so this idea of being playful and bringing in these other references, in particular popular culture, and things that have moved us. So David Bowie is someone that Neil is particularly interested in. Rock and roll, to me. So this is the Dirac equation. So in some sense, the idea of quantum mechanics is a form of rock and roll. To me. Yeah.
You also mentioned, if we're going down this route, I am also thinking, I keep thinking with this exhibition about pop culture and the way that it's manifesting in space right in this moment, like Katy Perry going to space, which we all have thoughts about. But you talked about in a past conversation specifically this idea of pop culture prophets, citing David Bowie and Jimi Hendrix. Can you go on about this idea of prophets for us?
There are contemporary prophets, artists and musicians, things that, in my mind anyway, that explore these nonlinear, these associations that don't necessarily lead to a lot of money, although it can. It's exploring other things, exploring the human imagination, exploring feelings instead of rational kind of dynamics as a kind of high point. So I think that's a real important, I think, part of what we're trying to do is that there's an art process involved there. There's a lot of information, but it is processed through the imagination. And so even like I think I was mentioning the science, the idea of, so Schrodinger's cat, I'm sure you have some sense of that. Is the cat alive or dead? The simultaneous nature of this thing. So as soon as part of that whole theory, as soon as you look at something, it actually changes. So how do we really know when we look at something? So we built this entire idea of what our reality is based upon observations that may or may not be, tuned in. There may be alternatives and things. So that kind of place in between, I think, is where art starts to really operate. It brings in feelings. It brings in other kinds of, brings in the imagination into a kind of more rational sort of structure.
I knew we were going to get weird, and I'm happy to be here. Can you, to the pop culture thing, can we cite just some specifics? I know that Neil references R. Crumb as an influence when making these figures, which is very funny, and you can start to see that there. Yeah. But could you maybe tell the story of the sky fragments, the purple rain?
Okay. So that was originally from the last show, where the fourth dream of Gilgamesh was that the dream was that there was a rain, and there was a rain of purple molecules. And
Just to point out, they're like the purple pieces on the bottom shelf here. Yep.
So they were, and so in that other show, they were all tryptophan molecules, which is the enzyme for sleep. So there's this kind of weird anomaly there, is that you're dreaming of sleep, in a sense. But the way that it was interpreted in our sense is that this dream, which Gilgamesh forgot, because it was never written into the epic, and it was an opportunity for humanity to decide, are we an extractive society, or are we a nurturing society, a culture? And so the idea of, which goes back to more my idea, at least of the maybe romantic, because I'm heavily romantic, idea of the Paleolithic, where there were rituals for asking. So when I mine this copper out of the ground, I have a way of asking the ground. And it may not be able to answer in a certain way, maybe it does, but it's the mental state of being in that place where you are in repartee with what you're doing, rather than just assuming that it's there for you only. So the rhizomic and the idea of the alpha species, the dominant species. There's so much work being done now with interspecies dialogue between all kinds of, between insects and humans, between sea creatures, so it's really an interesting unfolding of some of these ideas in all different places. And so that's part of that idea myself.
The Epic of Gilgamesh also has a ecological component to it.
Yeah.
It's not only like the first written narrative that we have, but it's also the first written narrative where we have a hero come in conflict because he wants to chop down the forest,
yeah,
and does, and is punished for it, basically, because he doesn't ask permission and isn't in that conversation. Just bringing that up.
That's a cedar forest. Yeah. So some of the pink, the blue on that left thing, that's actually cedar branches that are dipped in clay and then fired out. They're a direct reference to that cedar forest.
So many references in the show. I'm going to go back because you mentioned, I want to be mindful of time, and I definitely want to touch on this. You wanted to talk about the library aspect a little bit more and the book. And I cannot encourage you all enough to flip through the 12-foot long book that is in this exhibition. Each page is 6 feet long. It's kind of like a two-man job to flip through the book. But if you wanted an insight further than this into John and Neil's practice, it's just amazing. There's actual terracotta clay on the pages of the book. You can see all of the kind of origin stories of where these ideas come from, and going back to divinations as well.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the library in your practice and the points within this exhibition that go to library, not only the book, the graphics. And also, I just want to point out that we're in a museum that is also kind of a library. It's like within these ways of disseminating information. So we're making our own library narrative of narratives again. So go ahead.
So the dioramas are considered part of the library. They're just a different display system than the traditional idea of books. It's maybe the idea of a narrative archive, an archive of ideas that, in this case, has a progression to it. Where on the lower shelves, you'll see if you look at the purple rain elements. Now the narrative is actually within the object. There's a conflation of elements that take, in many cases, a benzene ring, which is a basic organic molecule, and then works with it, does things with it. So the library is that structure, and then the book structure, but it's also really important because of the Library of Nineveh. So the idea, and so another one of the things that we toyed with, which in some ways the amphoras come from, is this idea of an apothecary. So, like in a pharmacy shop, that's a library of elixirs, a library of fixes, a library of distillations of, here's a whole set of chemicals that somebody has figured out that would do something that would take away pain, do something like that. And so that's a kind of library. So looking at this in a broader way, that notion has inflected itself into the show in different ways, some literal, some more submerged or embedded.
Yeah, I think just the way that narratives are dispersed is so interesting in this show. I also just want to come back to cuneiform quickly because if you've seen the show, there's like a crocodile that's swimming through the center of the show. And if you look closely, the scales on its back are cuneiform writing. Yeah. Can you talk just a little bit about that decision?
It was sort of, there it is. It came out of like many exchanges with Neil about that. And so the crocodile, in different form, we were going to do shelves that were in shapes of crocodiles, in other iterations of this design. And so it became a thematic, and it represents a primal animal, primarily from the Tigris and Euphrates. It's another layer into the Sumerian experience, as well as being a kind of archetype for, in different stories. And so Neil did that wonderful head. It's a really beautiful rendering. And you can see the ears are Assyrian, little ornaments. These are my works in particular. That jackal up above that's in my telescope is sort of, you have to look through this jackal. So you have to look back through another species in order to see the cosmos ahead. So it's a kind of, thinking ahead where they take star patterns and they make them into, there's the horse galaxy, the whole, Virgo, Sagittarius, all those things. So this is actually a hypothetical object, as to kind of how that might have happened.
I think we should talk about some of the object stories, maybe move from the themes. And could you give me the story of the origin device?
Origin device is the little thing on the floor that's got was it six different spheres, and most of the spheres have different variations on the idea of the eye. Some are glass eyes from taxidermy that might be for serpents. Others might be for goats and different species. So what it is actually, if you go to a planetarium and you see the device that is projecting the universe on the sky around you, so that's a projection system. So that was modeled, so that little device was modeled after that big device as being a perception system instead of a projection system. So it was kind of seen as a satellite in space, but it sees rather than projects. So it's more like it's kind of turning the tables on where do these things come from? And there's a little humor in there because there's also some blue tongues on one of those spheres with a really unruly hairstyle kind of sticking out of it. And that's where possibly what came from the cosmos in our creation story. Did speech come from the cosmos? So it's more like creating questions about where things came from and how humans have kind of interfaced this whole notion of information, of experience, of how we sensate the world. So it's all that stuff's kind of compressed into that in different ways.
We're going to go for questions in a second, but I love that that's kind of where we're ending because I feel like it's so emblematic. We can finally see it now. Yeah. It's so emblematic of the show in general. And one of our programs department folk also pointed out that it reminded them of the creation myth of Prometheus because Prometheus was picking the best pieces from animals to give to man, right? So he picked the best eyes, and here you have all of these eyes to choose from, and all of these ears and hair, etc. So I love that piece. It's a great piece in the show, and kind of wraps it up. Yeah. So, who has questions? Like, where can we start the rhizome now? Where else do we want to go? And I can kick us off if we want. Okay, I'll kick off with just a low ball. Another thing that's in here, obviously, is science fiction. So do you have a favorite work of science fiction, book, movie?
Yeah, there is, but I can't think of it. No, I mean, I started science fiction when I was in grade school, as soon as I could read. Heinlein, Arthur Clarke, a lot of all kinds of kind of traditional science fiction. Nowadays, there's a Chinese version of the three-body problem. That's a serial. That's pretty amazing. The stuff that's the kind of ideas that's fermenting. So it's really I think it's a spectrum, and it's had when I first saw Star Wars, I thought, oh, there was someone who made a movie for me. Of course, it was for everybody else, pretty much, who was kind of thinking like that. But it was sort of like the idea that it actually had space in it, and it was kind of done in a sort of fluid way. So the science fiction, it's movies, it's all kinds of things besides books.
Keep going. I have another question. What does do you remember what the cuneiform on that cistern says?
The cuneiform is, it's a quote from Parmenides, who was considered to be he's a Greek philosopher quite a ways from Samaria and about 1,500 years later, who was considered the father of ontology. And so it basically, it just says something really simple, like there's only one road. And what that means is that he was an essentialist. He was the person that pretty much gave Plato the idea of this the perfect sphere that we are always in approximation of. So it's sort of like, anyway, but the idea of that road is sort of kind of putting together things that talked about the roadmap to Stardust. We don't really know what that is, Neil and I. It's a feeling state. It's a lot of ideas. It's a lot of things that are unfolding. So we were willing to draw from many different things. The idea of finding actually a statement, and particularly someone who was that, terse, so to speak, was interesting. And I thought, because you can't read it unless you know cuneiform, so there it is. It's right there. It's kind of, it could be something really much more, a little softer. We don't know.
So a quick question. So we're living in a period where everything's so fast, and it's even going to be faster.
Yeah.
I'm going to repeat her question in case people didn't hear. She said, we're living in a world where things are so fast and they're going to be faster.
Yeah, so is this a way of slowing down, or is this a way of connecting the past to the future? Or?
I see.
Is this a way of slowing down or connecting the past to the future?
I guess I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, I think because I go back to the nonlinearity idea, where all time may be in this moment, all the time. Or we just don't know it. So it's this idea of perception and our relationship to it. So all the things about digital technology and stuff that's going on, I think, are all part of a narrative. I'm not sure where that narrative is playing, it's going to end up, or what it's going to become. I think because of my background in earth sciences, the idea of geologic time, I'm amazed at a geologist that looks at a stratigraphic section and says, okay, that's 230 million years. What? I remember maybe 5 years ago, I remember when I was born, I looked sort of early years. So it's interesting that it's in this hypothetical kind of idea. There's always evidence and tests and things like that that give them that information. But it's still, in my sense, it's speculative. It's very informed speculative of a certain way, of a certain path that has to do with how you read reality and read time. So I just think of it as an open question. I don't, it's fast, but maybe the Romans, when the Visigoths were coming, it was even faster. Like, holy shit, here they come. So it's hard to say.
Thank you for your talk. Your work is really interesting and amazing. I'm a student of Neil Forrest, way back.
Cool.
So I'm curious about this collaborative process, and it's two of you. So I see that there's boundless amounts of iterations these could take. Have you ever thought about adding more complexity, other people, other voices, or do you add?
So in 2009, we curated a show for Zaccheo in Phoenix. There were 6 artists, and so that's one model. We've done that a little bit. We did propose another show for Zaccheo that was about signs in relationship to ceramics, and that was a whole bunch of people. Kristen Morgan was one of the people. I can't remember the whole list, but we do think of that. This is a really special opportunity that was kind of really the first time that we weren't doing Zaccheo. So it was kind of like, let's grab this, it sounds great. But there's always an opening, because as the ideas generate, we might have, it might be interspecies as well as all kinds of other people. We don't know. But there's no real closed system at this point.
That's really exciting.
Or Cloud X is growing.
It's a big belt. It's out there, yeah.
Second row, Bree. I have a question about your jackal and the telescope.
Yeah.
And I was curious about if you can see through it, if you could get up there, and why you chose the jackal, and how
how the layers of it sort of signify different things.
Okay, I think you theoretically could see through it. It is open all the way, and there are tubular elements that connect that are open, so it should work. It's just, part of it was in a museum, we did talk about it, having it low enough, but how low for what person, you know, sort of like, well, and then you have steps for the shorter people. So it became more about a display, just put it up there and let people think about it. But the jackal is, so that was my real interest, was the idea of animism as being part of the Paleolithic. And so in the interspecies part of that. So that model is actually a coyote in terms of the, it's a taxidermy model I took a mold off of. But I think a coyote is really North American. And so that whole mythology is, I wanted to kind of go more towards what might have been in Eurasia. And so there were species of jackal as part of the research. I looked at all that stuff. And so I took that thing and I took ears from it might have been from a fox, from a taxidermy, and made another mold of that. And so I created my own, in a way. And the jackal, because of the Egyptian god, the jackal, that seemed to kind of resonate. And so they were all in that part of the world. And so it really represents the animus to give voice to an animal or the other species in this creation of the story. The oddball part, in a way, is that those cone shapes are actually models taken from a Saturn rocket engine. So the form, the shape of it. So it's kind of like, it's a hybrid. And one of them is covered with more branches made from dipped in slip of a cedar. So inside and out are coated with that. So they're kind of, it's also a kind of rocket ship, odd, and telescope. And I don't know, I think it's kind of a sexy object, just by itself. So I just liked it. That's a lot of this, If I don't like it, I just, it may not make it. It has to, these things have to sing. I mean, that's that purple haze part,
Yeah.
Can you share how your love affair with clay began?
With clay? I think I mentioned a little bit of it. Was the Vietnam War. I was in college at UC Davis. Just started taking a couple of art classes, and it turned out that Bob Arneson was the ceramic teacher, and I took one of his classes, and it's just like, oh my God. So the really nice thing about, and they still have it, is there's this building called TV9, which was a building that was an old garage used by the university to repair vehicles, and they built a new one. So they said, anybody want it? Bob said, we'll take it. So what was so beautiful about that is that I go home, I was teaching in Kentucky in the 70s, and I'd come in the summers and he just said, go build a studio in back, go in the, and so move some boxes around and get some tables and just make a studio. He just wanted people working. So there was really the ethos of what ceramics meant, and it was infectious. So there were all kinds of people working, and they were firing, and it was because it was that sort of oddball building. We could be there 24 hours, and they had a thing in the back that was, where they would cast aluminum. And so it was a cauldron, and so we would just throw a burning rag in there, and there'd be a flame like 8 feet high coming out, at midnight. And the guards, and the campus guards knew to leave us alone. We were okay, So they were never bothered. It was so this idea of community, I think, and a spirit of working. So that all added up, in the ceramic, and then the material just, kind of felt right after a while and stuff. So.
It's so interesting, too, like, it's just like, it was one of those moments that was kind of perfect. Like the Bay Area with ceramics, with our long history of ceramic artists, with you learning from Robert Arneson, with Peter Volkus, like there just is this kind of magic here for clay.
Yeah. It's really fortunate to be part of that, and just I was a chair of ceramics and sculpture at our institute for a while, and and so there's always so many people you can invite to do talks, and we have workshops, and it's a wonderful medium for people to just start working, start doing stuff and play. In a way, they didn't. You could make mistakes. It would be harder to do in maybe some other mediums. And it wasn't a mistake that, it's like, okay, I just learned something. It's like, it's repartee. It goes back to Shintoism. It goes back to this idea of how letting material speak. So, I'd like to tell the story of a Japanese village where it's in Japan, where they would have like a 7-chamber firing, climbing kiln. And it would take a whole week. The entire village all had a role in making the stuff for this. Some people were chopping wood. But what was beautiful is that when you fired off the first chamber, the heat going up the hill was preheating the next one. So then that was fired. Then it would go up. So there's some really beautiful stories. And there's also, in the original firing, the same object. It was called the Old Man, and there's a picture of it, online someplace. So it was a record of all the firings of that village over decades, millennia probably. So it was getting more and more kind of, bearing the weight of that history, but it was beautiful. So anyway, there's things like that are kind of in the mix.
But yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. So when I see the blue-colored tongue, it reminds me of the East Asian Indian artwork I've seen. The paintings. Is there a connection?
You're thinking of tantric art? It's very simple.
I've seen them at museums. They're usually like a deity. I think it's Hindi or Hindu.
So it might be subliminal. I probably have seen it. What it was I was interested in. So that's a taxidermy. And there's another one that didn't make it in the show, but it's the whole mouth of a bear. Because when you want to stuff a bear, which God forbid, I guess, you kill a bear and stuff it, but these parts don't last. So you get plastic ones, you get fake ones, and you paint them up and put them in there. And so that's all available. So you can get tongues of different animals, as part of that. So that was the one that seemed, it's about the right size, And also you'll see there's some really big ears. Those are moose ears. And there are smaller ears. It's either a fox or something in that scale.
Can I ask like a topper question to that? We didn't actually get to that all of the work and all of the play work is terracotta in the show, which is an important kind of piece of that. But could you talk about the decision for the blue glaze?
Oh, okay. So the blue glaze that's on the cedar dipped, burnt out sort of structures. There's a blue glaze that was in you can still see a few sandblasted blocks in the city of Uruk, which is one of the early Sumerian cities. And if you've been to Berlin, the gates of Ishtar are also a similar blue. So what I was interested in was, well, what kind of glaze could they have made then? And so pretty much just basic ceramic knowledge is that it was an alkaline glaze, because if you use the most common material would be copper. If you put copper in a lead glaze, it turns really green. This was bluish. So I mixed a little cobalt in with that, but I wanted raw materials, because you can go to the ceramic store and buy pre-made colorants and do that. So I wanted it to be as if, as close as I could get, as if it was the glaze that they might have made. So that's that.
All right, I think we have taken enough of your time. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, Henry.